Доброго дня, дорогі колеги. Радий вітати вас в українському.
Hello, we are happy to welcome you in the Ukrainian Crisis Media Center. And today we present the of research on historical narratives about Ukraine in mass media. And today our presenters are Mr. Volodymyr Shiko, Director General of the Ukrainian Institute, Natalia Popovich, President of One Philosophy and co-founder of the Ukrainian Crisis Media Center, Irena Matveishin, a journalist and analyst from Internews of Ukraine, Lyubov Cebulska, leader of the hybrid threats analysis group of the UCMC, and I am Ali Maliyev, Deputy Director General of the Ukrainian Institute. Upon request of the Ukrainian Institute and One Philosophy's analytical company Cornerstone had carried out continental content and context analysis of European mass media issued between 2018-2019 about key events in the 20th century, which had an impact upon Ukraine in the global processes. More than 44 biggest mass media were analyzed from the UK, Germany, France, Poland, Ukraine, and Russia, and more than 7,392 materials were analyzed on the Great Famine, Holodomor in Ukraine, the Second World War, Chernobyl disaster, democratic processes, and in the post-Soviet space. So my question is to Volodymyr Shiko. Why this topic? Why you decided to carry out this project? We wanted to analyze the hard data and evidence-based decisions made by politicians, diplomacy leaders, etc. And we found out that there are some distortions or distorted perception of Ukraine among foreign countries, and this should be taken into account when we build up our work in the international context in order to present properly the topics which are primarily important for Ukraine. In order to formulate the question correctly, you have to know that you have partially at least know the answer to this question. To pose the question in right way, you should know the right answer in advance, beforehand. In order to send proper messages, we need to understand how people get information about Ukraine. So the research which we are presenting today is of importance because this is an attempt to understand how the informational flows influence the modern human being everywhere in the world, how that young personality is brought up, what influences its formation, how then this adult human is influenced by the informational flows in everyday life, how much it is dependent on the relative relatives, of friends, of their opinions, etc. And all that is important for understanding what to analyze, what to take into account when doing our research about Ukraine. So Natalia Popovich will explain how we selected that mass media that influences on millions and millions Europeans who and which shape the perception of Ukraine among those Europeans. For us, it is important to understand how to formulate, how to build up proper public policies, how to communicate these public policies. And we have already planned the follow-up step for the next year based on this research. I keep saying that analysis and survey should constitute the foundation for each policy decision. Natalia, with this, I would like to give the floor to you. You were among those who were the drivers of this research, of this survey, and I believe it's just to give you the floor for presentation. I would like to thank to the entire team of the Ukrainian Institute, to Volodymyr personally. I believe that all our efforts were not wasted looking at the conclusions, that the outcome of our research. Volodya was right when he mentioned that in each country, the human identity, the national identity is being developed during the entire life, and the realities inside the country, and also with the influence of informational flows. And we try to understand the relations between narratives, European narrative, Russian narrative, Ukrainian narrative, and to assess and evaluate the context in which Ukraine appears in all that three narratives. Quite often I believe that with the scarce resources, allocation of which is quite painful now for the work of governmental institutions, we should definitely know which allocation, which investment would bring the best, the very best result. And also, it is extremely important to keep in mind that today, under the crisis of democracy, under growing attractiveness of the authoritarian regimes, the diplomacy should act proactively, spreading truthful information, build up dialogues, build up bridges between progressive forces in all the countries. And this creative process should not be hindered with our imagination about the past, with our vision of past and the existent narrations of the past. because this may influence the serious differences in understanding such an important things as the human rights and the freedom of speech, as the freedom of expression. And that's why One Philosophy Ukrainian Institute wanted to understand the differences in interpretation of the major historical events in the 20th century, reflected in the in mass media. I would like to show my presentation. We had analyzed more than 7,392 publications in 44 media releases from the UK, Germany, France, Poland, Ukraine, and Russia. And these were quite different mass media, quite different publications. You can see the logos of all of them and can understand, if you're familiar with them, how different they are. And the next slide. This slide shows, and the next slide, please. We would like to share the major conclusions, and then I will give the floor to Volodymyr. He will provide some recommendations. So, the major conclusions. As the players on this field, we should understand that narrative conflicts are inevitable in course of historical memory and dialogue between nations, and this vision and interpretation shapes our vision and approach of today. As of now, of course, Russia continues to take Ukraine as a subject. It tries not to mention Ukraine in the context of the Second World War. Also, analysis of Ukrainian mass media allows to understand Ukrainian position this year. These days we are commemorating the anniversary of the Great Famine of Holodomor from 1931-1933 in the UK. Mass media. Holodomor was presented as a political intentional famine organized by the Soviet power. The only exclusion was The Guardian, which explained Holodomor as a genocide organized by Stalin. In French mass media, they did not define clearly that this was a genocide. In Germany, it was some doubts about recognition of Holodomor genocide, but nevertheless, the more or less the same. Although there are some differences in interpretation of Holodomor, but there are much in common. In May, we presented our research, which proved that there was a unified narrative of Ukraine and European countries about Holodomor. The only exclusion was Russia. Ukrainian word Holodomor is used by other authors. For example, one of Australian research expressed hope that such words taken from different languages will come into other languages. That's why the word Holodomor will, instead of Great Famine, will go to other languages. And it is quite important to build up this narrative inside the country. Also, there are some terms which as of now are not very much known abroad. For example, Ukrainian Avant-Garde. As an executed renaissance in 2018, more attention was devoted by European mass media to Holodomor, while in 2019, more attention was given to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Then appearance of Agnieszka Holland's documentary about Holodomor provoked a splash of interest to Holodomor once again. Another aspect is that importance, which is stirred up by the by the country leaders. For example, documentary The Price of Truth, which appeared quite recently, provoked 3 times less discussions than it used to be during the first presidency. The next item is also important. We have to analyze our history by ourselves and not expect that this should be done by other country scientists. For example, if we want to present either Alexander Davzhenko or Kazimir Malevich and present them to the world, we have to understand what we think about them first in Ukraine, and then to present our vision to the world. For example, as of now, Alexander Davzhenko and Kazimir Malevich are not seen as the representatives of executive Renaissance or as representatives of the Ukrainian Avant-Garde. Our research had revealed that a set of topics require more attention. For example, the Yalta Conference of 1945 is insufficiently studied from Ukrainian point of view. The historic narrative about the USSR as part of the Eastern Europe and its impact on the Eastern Europe is underestimated everywhere in the Western Europe, except perhaps the one Guardian publication. Also, there is a huge lack of understanding that aggressive states, when they are not immediately punished, they simply postpone the problem, not resolve it. In mass media, even now, there are some restricted topics. The Estonet says while in Russia, inside Russia and in post-Soviet space continue the approach, they should be blamed, which is reflection of the old Soviet approach and distort the truth about Munich Pact. In many countries in Europe, Eastern European countries always commemorated the victims of that pact from both sides. Then the division of the post-war world in result of the Yalta Conference should be rethinked, and the Russian or post-Soviet narrative should be overcome. The topic of democratization in post-Soviet space was the least attractive for discussion in mass media. Quite often we find that these reforms, they progress slowly, too slowly, that there are big gap between the Western and Eastern Europe, which is reflected in the Eastern Neighborhood Initiative, but there is no deep analysis of the value level harmful impact of the Soviet past upon Eastern democracies. In Ukraine, we observe that up to 70% in Ukraine population is in Ukraine. They do not fully trust to each other, and in Western media, you may trace up the narratives which say that Russian Empire always continued to remain the Russian Empire, even when it was called the Soviet Union. What we wanted to see more? We wanted to see more reflections. We wanted to see reflection about decommunization, about the impact of the Chernobyl disaster on the collapse of the Soviet Union. Western mass media, despite attention to Chernobyl disaster, lack to identify that tolerance to fake information coming from Russia, from the former Soviet Union, from Russia, it undermines the capacity of Western world to distinguish between what is true and what is false. Unfortunately, they believe that the post-Soviet people are stuck in the old Soviet reality, and the true understanding how a Chernobyl disaster undermined the rest of trust to the residuals of trust to the former Soviet regime. Also, all mass media lack understanding that becoming the society of truth requires years and dozens of years of intensive work. For many years, the West kept believing that the communism itself and communist ideas were the main threat, instead of understanding that the biggest threat is an authoritarian nature of Russia or new Russian empire, which is based on the export of hydrocarbons, etc. Also, there is an outlook on the future prospects of Ukraine's development from the Finnish way to the US way, and which present a wide spectrum of visions how Ukraine may develop in future. All those aspects are interesting, are important, and revealing incorrect or false interpretations are the first step to counteraction of Russian vision, Russian perspective, which continues to influence the perception of Ukraine abroad. With this, I would like to give the floor to Volodymyr Sheiko.
Thank you very much, Natalia, for this comprehensive conclusion. Vladimir, how can the researchers and cultural institutions work with such material of the research? Thank you very much, Natalia, for this comprehensive report about this research. The first thing we may do, we may read it. This report will be available on online resources of Ukrainian Institute and One Philosophy. And this is a big volume of information, we understand, but that we didn't cover all the media landscape and all the aspects that form perception of Ukraine and information about Ukraine in the media, but it is not less comprehensive than we may think, because we mentioned the main points. Many researchers study, and lay people and decision makers are interested in this topic. For us, it would be really interesting to understand the perception and how information is provided. This is a valuable source of information for any policy, for any politicians who take decisions. And we hope that our colleagues in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and many other actors who deal with cultural and public diplomacy, both in state bodies and NGOs, we hope that they will take this into account in their activity. I would like to propose several conclusions that are of interest for all of us for our work. First is the importance of the colonial vision and strategic communication of the state and in cultural and public diplomacy. Natalia spoke about this a lot. The topic of Ukrainian identity and how it is reflected in the media in the West. For a long time, history of Ukraine was not written in Ukraine. It was not written by Ukrainians. There is a presence of post-colonial, even colonial vision from the side of so-called Western world. And this is a vision on Ukraine and other countries of the region that as the countries that should be democratized, they should be brought up to the upper level. And this is a colonial view, in essence, and many processes are lost. Those processes that were ongoing, that these processes of democratization, human rights processes to set Ukraine as a state, as subject, and we should study these processes. We didn't appear as a state in 1991, and our civil society didn't appear that year. We see that we had long history of this, and mass media, they do not know about this. And also it is important to stress this identity of Ukraine. We should not, I always criticize this new East area, that this is something homogeneous that is interesting to study, with some interesting Soviet past, but somehow unified, some exotic East. And this nullifies cultural peculiarity of Ukraine. And in cultural diplomacy, and we do it as the Ukrainian Institute, and we believe that this is an important conclusion. This identity, this differentiation should be stressed, and we should bring up the names of people, cultural, historic events that state important fact that Ukraine is a separate country with the sovereign territory, with its own language and history. And Ukraine, as a sovereign state, has the right to form our own historic narratives about our country, and should not always use those that were done instead of us. Also, importance of storytelling in cultural and public diplomacy. It is important to speak difficult pages of history, and we should speak through human stories. Because it will help us to provide emotional message about those events and to provide this information to foreigners, these human stories that are told by the language of culture. No official communication or official political and state communication may replace this instrument. And for this, we should not provide traumatic experience. We should not force people to relive it. And we have such discussions, and on the eve of the observance of Holodomor Day, we speak about important matters as how to speak about the Great Famine. Should we cook something from the bark of the tree because people were forced to eat it during the Holodomor, and we believe that such things are not ethical, and cultural diplomacy should find the way how to speak about those things with the due respect to victims, with respect to those people who were traumatized by this tragedy. And human stories should be provided, and in Ukraine we have witnesses, live witnesses of such events, and they provide evidence. These are live voices of people, and we should do cultural interventions, and they are more delicate, and at the same time they are emotional, with proper tone to provide such information in international mass media. We spoke about manuals as a source of getting information and formation of conscious in order to provide young people with information. And this is the next project with the one philosophy, and Natalia is helping us with terms of reference for this project, and we would like to see how Ukraine is presented in the manuals, history books of several European countries, and also about the importance of academy in the formation of narratives. Academia is important because these manuals are based on scientific discourse about history, about art, about culture. That's why in the context of cultural diplomacy, the work with Ukrainian studies abroad and international universities and expert centers, think tanks, is very important, because these institutions, they are the source from which the information goes to the manuals, to mass media, to conscious and perception of millions of people. This aspect of cultural diplomacy is difficult to overestimate. In the process, we should understand that cultural diplomacy and public diplomacy is the field for many actors, and among them there should be proper dialogue, cooperation, and they should act together, at least at the stage, at the level of understanding who does what and where we are moving, and be able to say why we are doing this, not to have 10 different images of Ukraine or different perceptions of the past, or civil society that the information that is provided by civil society, and they have different opinions, different views, and they provide them to foreign countries. And at the level of state policies, Ukraine should elaborate this one voice policy concerning principle, the most important things about interpretation of our past, and to coordinate the activity of different actors who are involved in these actions. And lastly, I would like to say about the importance of continuation of research in the Ukrainian Institute this year. We have final stage of research concerning perception of Ukraine among specialists in 7 countries of Europe, plus US, Japan, and Turkey. And this is one more brick and the comprehensive picture we would like to compose in order to see how Ukraine is perceived abroad. And here we had a discovery, and Natalia mentioned about this briefly, about those names that are associated or do not associate with Ukraine abroad. Malevich was called, and we composed a list of names, events, cultural persons, and also those representatives of different ethnicities who live in Ukraine or who are connected with Ukraine. And preliminary results of research show that abroad, even specialists do not know such people. Even those who work in cultural management or mass media, not everyone knows even Malevich or associate him with Ukraine. And I won't even say about those persons for whom several cultures or several countries compete. There is a chaos in this area, and maybe we should do a lot in Ukraine in order not just to bring something back to us, but just to declare what we have that is really Ukrainian in the sense. And I believe that we should speak broadly about the results of such research, and we should continue because, I repeat, even only if we have proper evidence, we will be able to move this cause further. So we have a big home task. Do we have Любовь? Okay, good afternoon.
Lyubov, I would like to ask you a question based on the research. How this survey, this research is related to the hybrid threats and how they could, how we could counteract to the Russian vision, Russian representation of the related events. Thank you. We analyze Russian propaganda, and in the context of this research, it is useful to analyze how the Russian ideologists make a good use of the lack of Ukrainian vision and representation of that Ukrainian vision. This Russian perspective has a huge impact on the Russian and Russian-speaking audience of the former Soviet Union. Unfortunately for us, and fortunately for Russia, Russia knows quite well how to present Ukraine, what perception of Ukraine to create, and they keep saying all this, keep saying the same for a long period of time. They present Ukraine as purely Russian territory, which is a failure state, which is now has the fascist regime on it. And speaking about Russian propaganda, you cannot but mention the historic narratives, because historic narratives are implicitly present in all Russian discourses, in education and in political, in cultural. Russia always preserved that revision style approach to education, to educational policy, to the diplomatic policy, etc. And now they can do this even strongly with YouTube, with social media, etc. Also, it's worth to mention how much Russia how much money Russia spends on that. More than 4 billion rubles were invested into cinema production or production of documentaries devoted to, so to say, Russian history, and they have the Victory TV channel, which is devoted specifically to the Second World War. This brings us to the issue of topics in Russian revenge-based approach. There are several huge topics, mega narratives like the Second World War, which is called primarily to communicate one main message, that the Russians are the nation of winners, and we are winners despite technological advances among our enemies, despite all the treasons or untrustfulness of our allies, and this brings in Ukrainians or the Brits, etc. And in this context, they try to exploit the topic of the Poltava battle. And quite recently, I looked through the several magazines devoted to the Poltava battle, and the general staff officer quite recently discussed the Poltava battle of the early 18th century in this context which I just described. What is the biggest problem for us? We have to deal with this vision of this future generations, because the current generation in Russia probably could not be convinced in the true things and in true vision of the past, but we should build up the vision of the future generations, and the only way to do this is to shape our own vision. This brings us back to what Volodymyr mentioned. We should have the clear understanding, clear vision who we are, where we are, and what narrative about ourselves we would like to communicate to other nations. Actually, the vision who we are would be shaped even without us if we do not step in and take a proactive measures. Perhaps with this, I would like to make a pause and allow other speakers to intervene. I would like to give the floor to Irina, who works with the Internews Ukraine, and is able to add how do we perceive ourselves and what is perception of us by others, how this research correlates with the rest of your studies. Yeah, I should say that this your survey is quite related to our Ukraine World project, which is an English-speaking project in the Internews, and another project, Stories from Ukraine, which we had launched in September. On the framework of that project, we carried out a survey of narratives and topics about Ukraine which might be interesting for the world. We tried to identify what is lacking in the international media space about Ukraine. We carried out that survey among foreign experts. These were foreign journalists working and writing about Ukraine, either abroad or in Ukraine. Also, we surveyed experts from Ukraine working abroad. That was done without involvement of artificial intellect. We questioned around 200 people, and we have received rather interesting data. We had identified those narratives which are negative for Ukraine, like poverty, the war, oligarchs, corruption. These are the topics related to Ukraine, which quite often are associated with Ukraine in foreign mass media. This goes along with many stereotypes about Ukraine, which are imposed alongside with the true negatives by foreign mass media. There are some positive messages that Ukrainians are ready to express hospitality, that nature is beautiful, the cities are beautiful, like Kyiv, etc. There are some narratives which are positive, but they are popular only among those people who had already attended Ukraine, and for them they are appealing. There are journalists who have been living here for years, and those journalists who come here totally unprepared, without any vision what to expect. My friend from Paris, a journalist who covers the war in Donbass, he quite often keeps saying that Ukraine is almost unknown in the West. Unfortunately, there are not so many not so many topics which, except maybe war, etc., which might bring Ukraine in the center of Western attention. Unfortunately, we do not have a strategy, what messages to send to the international information space. Quite often these are confusing messages Babchenko case, SBU case, all that messages, they are able to ruin the entire work of the civil organizations and activists who try to raise the image of Ukraine. These scandals or negative information, they considerably harms and distorts the image of Ukraine and undermine the vision of Ukraine by foreign journalists. Quite often they are very much confused where to find reliable information, what's going on in reality. So among those topics which we had revealed based on the narratives, we found out that there are many topics worth to be covered, which now are covered very narrowly from just one angle. Just an example, the ultra-right movements in Ukraine. This is one of those top topics which could be seen in mass media. This is the topic which easily could be manipulated with, and it's easy to discredit Ukraine based on that topic. Of course, this topic, if it is chosen, it should be covered sustainably, in balance with proportion, with well-balanced proportions. Sometimes sometimes journalists writing in about Ukraine, they do not live in Ukraine. Many journalists writing about Ukraine, they live in Moscow, and this Western presentation of Ukraine is quite often built up on post-Soviet or pro-Russian vision of Ukrainian events. And quite often our messages about Ukraine does not match the Western mainstream understanding. The problem of our journalists trying to present Ukrainian materials abroad are unable to present what they are writing from the Western point of view. They are unable to present to interpret Ukrainian context. We have to present the context, remind the dynamics of this context. In your survey, you mentioned the topic of the war and the Second World War. You should present Ukraine as a success of democratic development in post-Soviet space. Of course, there are problems, and you should not silence those problems. We have the problem of veterans, we have the problem of IDPs, And all those issues could be presented in dynamics via development, via the struggle. And these are the stories which we lack. I fully agree with you that we have to develop storytelling, and our Renaissance supported, Renaissance Foundation supported project, the stories from Ukraine, is actually aimed at this purpose, to present Ukrainian history in the stories of individual people. Thank you to the viewers, thank you to the participants. I would like to remind you that full review of this research and survey could be found on the websites of UCMC, of One Philosophy, and the Ukrainian Institute. And I would like to remind you that quite soon we will involve this and include these results into our everyday work. Before saying goodbye, I would like to give the floor to presenters. 1 minute from each presenter.
Volodya, let's start with you, and then I will make conclusions. Thank you very much, dear colleagues. Your reflections are really valuable. Irina, it is really interesting for us. I'm really interested in your opinion, and we are going to work on this topic, and I would like to speak about what Luba said about positive narratives as the only productive way how to counteract Russian propaganda and Russian narratives. And this message is really close to me because, often communications outside, they are framed by what Russia does, and we are in reactive position. We are trying to contradict their narratives, and in the modern media, the first that is said is more important than the response. And in our work, we should take this into account, and we should not only respond and contradict, but to provide proper content about Ukraine, those narratives and stories that will provide an alternative frame. Positive, not in the sense that this is only interesting information, that we provide good information about us, but also that it should have added value. And those stories, narratives, will help us to promote many activities, interventions that will provide benefit to us. This is one of the conclusions I would like to provide. Thank you. Dear colleagues, please, you are given the floor. Yes, you reminded one more aspect about the response to propaganda. And propaganda, this is one of the mistakes. We believe that we should use our own identity to stress what is ours and to provide the first floor. We should not be we should not be reactive. One more aspect, this problem that persists. People are tired of difficult topics, and we are speaking about Ukraine in the context of war with Russia, and There is some competition in the information space about this, and this also is not good for proper communication. We should speak about us, we should position ourselves independently as Ukraine, as a separate country, as a separate nation, not as a post-Soviet country. Thank you. Natalia and Lyubov, you have 1 minute, please. So I will be the first one to speak. I would like to see inspiring examples. For example, example of Estonia. At some moment they said that we are a small country, but we are IT country, and they started to develop this sector. Also, I attended courses at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and they spoke about diplomacy, about culinary diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, and they said they decided that they should show bright representatives to the world. For example, we have a bright composer, and we may speak about the country of art and culinary art. Maybe also there are countries that do not sell objects. They communicate some ideas. For example, Sweden, they speak about morals, about gender equality, and Sweden is the only country that is in the rating for the second time, stopped the list of the countries of the world that with the highest level of good, with the highest values. So we should identify those things. Our narratives should be natural for our population. We should not invent them. We have them. They exist. We should form them properly. What we want to say to the world and to speak in one voice. If this is natural, our population, our citizens will become ambassadors of these narratives, and the country will speak for itself. We won't need to have excessive efforts from the state. Thank you. Natalia, thank you very much, dear colleagues. We thank Vladimir for partnership and for your reflection, for your position. And we thank Internews and also I believe that I understand, Vladimir, we should not imitate anything. Imitation won't bring success in the world, and there are projects that are supported by the Ukrainian Institute, and there should be proper financing for the Ukrainian Institute. This is really important. Also, Ukraine doesn't equal Russia, and we should have our proper ideas, and we should communicate them to the world. And these can be different things: music, art, different projects, folk music groups, and they are liked in the world. And there are different projects, different interesting things, and we try to help them. And also one voice policy. We had such a project, and we should unite our efforts in Ukraine. We have less resources, but we may be more efficient if we unite our resources. Wonderful example is Ukraine World Project, and with Vladimir Yermolenko, we decided to unite the databases of Ukraine Crisis Media Center and Internews to provide updates to people from different Ukrainian cultural actors, and there is a special platform, and we provide information to different people about what is going on in the country, and they get truthful information. And it is important to unite efforts of non-state actors, and also there should be proper synergy between state institutions and NGOs. And I would like to bring the example of Denmark. They also reformat their ideas. They are presented as a design country, and they may also promote different ideas. And there is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Cultural Institute, and a cultural agency, and arts fund, and open data institution. This is an analog of Open Ukraine or Invest in Ukraine. We should unite the efforts, and those projects that exist, they may be used with bigger return on investment, because we created the legacy from online side to the left is about Ukrainian avant-garde. This was the first wave, and this was also about innovations. Volodya Nurmolenko saw our site on innovation from Ukraine and innovators from Ukraine, that we create trailers about the best technologies in Ukraine, and they decided to make some materials that may be used in different settings in the media, in order that the audience be able to get information about important things. And there is a sense of urgency about cooperation, about our joint work, our efforts. We should not get tired, even in such places as our natural partner countries, Scandinavian countries. They understand the importance of democracy. And there was a forum last week about Russian-Western dialogue, and that means that Russia and the West, they resolve the issues, and other countries, they are trying to make their puzzles. And this Baltic, Ukrainian, and Eastern European, the countries of Eastern Partnership, they are outside the focus. That's why our efforts are really important, and our voice is really important in order to be present in this map with those things that are important for Ukraine. And I hope that our research will be important, and we plan to have a series of publication to provide information about different elements of research. We thank our Barbiera for editing of all the editions of report, and we thank the team of the Ukrainian Institute, and we are waiting for continuation of the project about the manuals, history books, in order to better understand what information is provided to young people about our history. So we elaborate this one voice policy, and we should also involve other institutions to this work, because this formation of our agenda of work is really important, and we should promote the image of Ukraine in positive context. And the Ukrainian Institute and our colleagues from other institutions are dealing with this. So please follow the news, and until the next time, goodbye.